Jake came home from his business trip late in the evening, exhausted but glad to be back. Jessica, his wife, who he'd started calling Jess ever since they first met in college, was there to greet him with a soft smile. She looked different to him now, maybe a bit more vibrant, a bit more eager, and tonight, a bit more something. But Jake brushed it off as his own tired eyes playing tricks on him after too many airport terminals. "Jake, honey, I have some news," Jess said with a small, almost shy grin. Her eyes sparkled, but Jake thought he saw something more, something that didn't quite match the smile she wore. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Jake paused, as if the words hung in the air longer than usual, like an echo he wasn't quite ready to face. Still, he quickly composed himself, giving her a reassuring nod and pulling her into a gentle hug. He told himself to act happy, even if inside, the news sat with a strange weight. "That's wonderful, Jess," he murmured softly. She took a breath and held his hand a little tighter. "We're going to have twins, Jake." Twins. That word seemed to press even harder on Jake's already heavy heart. He forced a smile and nodded along as Jess went on about doctors, due dates, and things that felt foreign to him. He was supposed to feel joy, he knew that, but instead, all he could manage was a hollow acceptance and a faint attempt to mirror Jess's enthusiasm. Before he knew it, she was on to another topic. "Oh, and we'll have to do one of those big gender reveal parties, you know? Maybe with fun contests and games. Doesn't that sound fun?" She practically bounced with excitement, her eyes sparkling. "Sure," he replied, trying to hide his weariness. "Whatever you want, Jess." Their young son, Alex, perked up when he overheard his mother. "A party?" he asked, his little face lighting up at the idea of games and festivities. Jake smiled at Alex, ruffling his hair, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that gnawed at him. He watched Alex, seeing him through a different lens now. Jake spent a bit of time with Alex, letting the boy chatter on about the party ideas Jess had mentioned. But even as he listened, his mind was elsewhere, lost in a muddle of suspicion and dread he tried to push down but couldn't. Jess's news had only solidified something Jake had long feared. He knew too much already. He had started to uncover Jess's secrets months ago, secrets that had shifted their family's foundation beneath his feet. And now, as the news of twins hovered in the air, he realized he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Their family was at a crossroads, and he felt as though he were standing alone, watching the road divide before him. A few days later, Jake found himself heading back to the airport, preparing for yet another business trip. The rhythm of Jake's life had long been set by the steady beat of work trips. Being away from home came with his job. He'd grown used to the long flights, the stale air of hotel rooms, the sight of unfamiliar cities under hazy morning skies. For years, Jake hadn't worried about what was happening back home. He'd trusted Jess completely, always believing their marriage was built on a foundation of honesty and love. But now, as he settled into his seat on the plane, a weight sat heavy on his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't known before, one that had been creeping in slowly but surely over recent months, a bitter, quiet unease. Jake had never been the kind of man to question Jess's loyalty. He loved her after all, and she was the mother of his son. But now some things just didn't sit right. Little details he'd pushed aside before now kept creeping back, pulling at him with nagging persistence. He flipped open his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys before they moved to open a folder. It wasn't his usual collection of project files or spreadsheets. No, this was something he'd kept hidden, locked away even from himself, like a bad dream he didn't want to remember. He started scrolling, letting his eyes scan over the familiar screen, absorbing the silent images playing out in front of him, but feeling none of the satisfaction he'd hoped he might. Instead, a hollow, sickening sadness swept over him as he scrolled through the contents. The videos only added to his unease, filling him with a strange, unexpected anger that he'd kept bottled up inside, trying to pretend it wasn't there. Jake closed his eyes for a moment and leaned back, trying to shake the sense of betrayal that seemed to be settling deeper in his bones with each passing second. His mind drifted, and suddenly, an image of Brian, his neighbor, floated into view. Brian, with his easygoing smile, the way he'd come over to help Jake clear the yard last summer without a second thought. Brian, who was always quick with a joke, a pat on the back, and a warm, friendly laugh. Could someone really be that good, that warm, that open, without hiding something underneath? The thought left a sour taste in Jake's mouth, and he couldn't shake it. People can be chameleons, he told himself. People can put on masks, especially those you trust the most. That's what kept him uneasy, the possibility that he'd been fooled. It all circled back to one thing, one final, unavoidable truth that kept his mind occupied. Even as the plane cut through clouds high above a world he suddenly felt disconnected from. Jake knew what was coming next. He had to be ready for that party Jess had planned, the grand gender reveal event she was so excited about. It would happen in a few months, she'd told him, and she'd hinted that it would be an event like no other, something their friends and family would remember for years. But as Jake sat there, looking out at the gray sky beyond his window, he knew that for him, this party wouldn't be about balloons and colored confetti. No, he would be preparing for something else entirely. Jake wanted to end it all, to tear down the shaky facade he and Jessica were living in, to finally step out of the lie he felt caged in. But he couldn't. Not yet. He needed time to get his affairs in order. There was too much at stake, and if he acted now, he'd risk losing more than just his peace of mind. For the first time, he found himself questioning the things he had once taken for granted about his family, even his little boy, Alex. Alex was only 6, his heart and his eyes pure, and the last thing Jake wanted was for him to be caught in the middle of a storm he never asked for. So, Jake would bide his time, hold on to his suspicions, and quietly build a path toward freedom. A way to walk away from the life he once loved with his head held high and his assets intact. The weeks crawled by like years, each one a strange mix of resentment, patience, and small preparations. Jessica was absorbed in the pregnancy, planning every detail of the twins' arrival with an excitement that would have been contagious in a different world. She chattered away about cribs and baby clothes, about how much fun the gender reveal party was going to be, never noticing the change in Jake. She didn't see how his once open gaze had turned calculating, how he'd started staying up late at night with his laptop, not for work, but to gather everything he'd need for the road he was planning to take alone. Jake played the role of devoted husband, keeping up appearances while he meticulously prepared for the life he'd soon be living on his own terms. He met with his lawyer in secret, made careful adjustments to his finances, and arranged a new living setup, something modest and quiet, away from all the pretense. He even found time to investigate matters regarding Alex, a process that had kept him awake with worry. And as the months slipped by, Jake became a master of patience. He'd smile on cue, laugh at the right times, but always with a growing sense of resolve. And finally, the day came. The day of the grand reveal. Their backyard was transformed. Colorful tables, flower arrangements, and banners welcoming guests surrounded the lawn. Friends and family mingled, and Jessica, looking every bit the glowing mother-to-be, with a beaming smile. The guests lined up for food, exchanging predictions about whether the babies would be boys or girls. Jake moved through the crowd quietly, his face serious, his thoughts miles away from the idle chatter. He wore his best suit, one he hadn't worn in years, and it fit him with a sharpness that matched the look in his eyes. His gaze fell on Brian, who was laughing with another neighbor near the refreshments. Jake's stare lingered, and for a moment, Brian noticed him. Flashing a friendly smile, Jake chose not to return. Today, Jake didn't need to pretend anymore. Jake stood tall, scanning the scene in front of him like a hawk, feeling the weight of months of secrets and silent resolve. He was ready for the step he'd been planning all this time, the step that would free him from the tangled mess his life had become. Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. The moment had arrived, and Jessica, practically glowing, took to the little platform they'd set up in the backyard. She called everyone's attention, smiling wide as she began her speech. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate this special day with us," she began, looking over the crowd of friends, family, and neighbors. "Family means everything to us, and with our 2 little ones on the way, we're just so excited to start this new chapter together. So, we thought a little fun contest would make today even more special." The crowd clapped, everyone eager for the grand reveal. In the center of the platform, a large balloon hovered, filled with confetti that would either be pink or blue. Jessica turned to Jake, eyes full of expectation. He took a deep breath, the weight of the past few months pressing down on him, but he managed to keep his composure. "Before we get to the big moment," Jake said, holding up a hand to quiet the crowd, "I'd like to give my wife a small gift." Jessica looked surprised, caught off guard, but she smiled, probably thinking this was just another sweet gesture to add to the day's excitement. Jake handed her a beautifully wrapped box, the ribbon tied neatly, the paper bright with colors that seemed almost cheerful in contrast to the heavy, stony look in his eyes. The crowd fell silent, curious to see what this gift was all about. Jessica opened the box slowly, her smile fading as she peeled back the paper and lifted the lid. Inside were 2 stacks of papers. The first stack was thick, legal, and stamped at the top with the unmistakable words, "Divorce Papers." The second stack, thinner but no less devastating, bore the title DNA Test Results, with Jake and Alex's names printed in bold. The color drained from Jessica's face as she pulled the papers out, struggling to comprehend what she was holding. The guests around them began to murmur, confusion spreading like wildfire. Everyone was frozen, waiting for an explanation that hung in the air, unspoken. Jake turned to face the crowd, his voice loud, cutting through the quiet. "I shouldn't be the one standing here," he said, his tone steely. "These future twins, this big reveal, it's not for me, it's for Brian." He pointed to the neighbor standing awkwardly near the back, drink still in hand. "Brian should be up here. He should be the one popping this balloon." The crowd gasped. Heads turned to Brian, who looked like he'd just been struck by lightning, his face pale and eyes wide in disbelief. His wife, standing next to him, went rigid, her hand gripping her glass tightly, her knuckles white. Jessica, still reeling, looked at Jake with tears welling up in her eyes. Her voice shook as she managed to choke out a question, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, these are divorce papers, and a DNA test. What's going on? Why are you doing this?" Jake met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a hard determination that had been building over months. "Jessica," he replied, his voice low but clear, "I know more than you think. I know about the secret life you've been leading, about the lies you've been feeding me, all while I was working hard for our family, and as for how I found out, well, it's all there, in black and white. I did what I had to do. Alex and I deserve the truth." The guests exchanged stunned looks, whispers growing louder as the pieces started to fall into place. The reality of the betrayal settled over the crowd like a dark cloud. The guests stood silent, a tense, almost surreal hush falling over the yard as everyone processed what had just happened. Jessica, still gripping the divorce papers and DNA results, looked as if her world had just shattered in her hands. She blinked, lips parted, too stunned to form words as Jake stood tall, unsmiling, waiting until the silence became almost unbearable. With a quick, calm breath, Jake spoke again. "Well, Jess, why don't we get back to what you planned?" he said, nodding toward the black balloon dangling above them. "Everyone's waiting for the big reveal after all." Jessica, wide-eyed and trembling, just stared, her mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. Jake stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice carrying a weary authority. "You know, it's funny how life works. While I was busy, working hard, planning for a future with my wife and son, my faithful wife was out there finding, let's say, adventures, and the embrace of another man." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the shocked crowd. "I could show you all the footage from the cameras I installed at home," he continued, his tone unwavering. "But dear guests, I'd rather spare you from those dirty videos. You don't need to see the details to understand what's been going on." Gasps rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances, some murmuring in disbelief, others stunned into silence. Jessica's friends covered their mouths, their shock and confusion written plainly across their faces. Jessica herself was breathing heavily now, her face a mix of horror and humiliation. "But that's not even the worst part," Jake said, his voice colder now. He looked directly at Jessica, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "The worst part is that all of this led me to question things I never wanted to question. I did a DNA test with my son Alex." He paused, the weight of his words sinking in with the audience. "It turns out Alex isn't my child." Jessica shook her head frantically, her face red with anger and disbelief. "No, Jake, no! This is insane!" she sputtered, her voice climbing to a near shriek. "What kind of sick joke is this? Alex is your son, and these babies, they're yours too." But her voice faltered, the conviction in her words drowned out by the guilt painted clearly on her face. Jake shook his head, unmoved. "I don't know who Alex's father is, Jessica. Maybe it's Brian. But what I do know for certain is that Brian is the father of these twins." The crowd fell dead silent, the impact of Jake's words settling in. All eyes turned to Brian, who stood pale and stiff, his mouth hanging open in stunned horror. His wife, standing beside him, stared at him, her own shock and hurt mixing with fury. Jake gave a small wave to the crowd, gesturing as though this were any other party, any other ordinary goodbye. "For those of you who want more details, you're welcome to join me at divorce court," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But it's time for me to go, to move on to a new life, one without the lies and betrayal." A ripple of whispers erupted among the guests as Jake took one last look around the yard. Jessica, unable to hold back any longer, burst into tears, her voice rising into a frantic, panicked shout. "No! This is all a lie, Jake! You can't believe this! I am your wife! I am faithful! This is just a sick misunderstanding!" She stumbled toward him, hands clutching the papers, pleading, "Jake, please!" But Jake merely turned his back on her. As he moved toward the gate, Brian tried to intercept him, his face twisted with anger. "Jake, come on! We need to talk! You can't just walk away!" Brian hissed, reaching out to stop him. Jake didn't break stride, and with a simple motion, he sidestepped and tripped Brian, sending him sprawling to the ground. Looking down at him, Jake's voice was low but firm. "You're not my neighbor, Brian. You're not my friend. You're the same kind of traitor as Jess, and I have nothing more to say to you." Without another word, Jake stepped over Brian and walked to his car, the guests parting as he moved through them. He got into the driver's seat, took one last look at the stunned faces surrounding him, and started the engine. With one final, steady glance back at his former life, he pulled out of the driveway, leaving the gasps, the whispers, and the shattered pieces of his past behind him. No one knew where he was going. All he knew was that he was driving toward a life that was finally his own. In the months that followed, Jake attended the divorce hearings with a steely calm, his preparation evident in every step he took. He had been ready for this, ensuring that his assets were secure, well hidden, and untouchable. He had shielded his finances with a precision that only he understood, leaving no loophole for Jessica to exploit. Every account, every investment, and every piece of property had been transferred to an entity beyond Jessica's reach. Jake walked into the courthouse knowing that he was miles ahead, that no matter what Jessica or her lawyer tried, they wouldn't be able to touch what he'd worked so hard to protect. The evidence he presented stunned the courtroom. In addition to the divorce papers, Jake submitted hours of video footage from the hidden cameras he'd installed in his home. There, clear as day, was Jessica in various rooms of their house, her arms wrapped around Brian, the two of them whispering, laughing, and slipping into places that should have been reserved for him. The footage, paired with Jake's account of his years on the road working tirelessly for his family, was damning. The judge's face hardened as he watched the tapes, Jessica squirming uncomfortably at her table, unable to look anyone in the eye. When the twins were born, Jessica and Brian's last hopes for any semblance of a future were crushed. A DNA test confirmed what Jake already knew. Brian was the father, not only of the twins, but also of Alex, the little boy Jake had raised as his own. The revelation was devastating, laying bare a 6-year affair that had spanned nearly half of Jake and Jessica's marriage. The timeline was clear. There was no denying that Jessica and Brian had been entangled in this deception for years. Brian found himself in a courtroom of his own. His wife, upon learning the truth, had promptly filed for divorce, armed with evidence Jake had shared with her out of decency. She walked away with almost everything, and a sizable alimony check. Brian, the man who once joked and laughed freely with Jake over the backyard fence, was now faced with 3 children and support payments he couldn't hope to manage. Jessica and Brian were left with nothing but each other, and a heap of debt, alimony, and the daunting task of raising 3 children without the security or trust they'd once taken for granted. For Jake, the outcome was everything he'd hoped for. He emerged from the trial with his assets intact and his dignity restored, knowing he hadn't allowed himself to be fooled any longer than necessary. People in the courtroom had seen through Jessica's defenses, through her attempts to paint herself as a misunderstood woman caught in a situation out of her control. The truth, stark and undeniable, had come to light, and Jessica was left to face the consequences with the partner she had chosen, whether knowingly or out of impulse, all those years ago. With the final judgment in his favor, Jake took a long, deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight of suspicion, heartbreak, and betrayal had been lifted. He wasn't the husband who had been blindsided. He was the man who had faced it all, prepared himself, and come out the other side stronger. As he walked out of the courthouse on the last day, Jake's mind drifted to the future. He thought of a quiet beach somewhere warm and bright, with an ocean stretching as far as he could see. That's where he would go next, he decided, to some place where the sound of the waves could drown out all the noise of the past year. He would let the sun and salt air mend his mind and heart, putting the pieces of himself back together. All he wanted now was peace, a fresh start, and a chance to reclaim his life, free from the shadows of betrayal. And he was finally free to do just that. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.